it's very clear what governments are trying to do. I think Lawrence Lepard said it best. They're trying to hold on to the privilege of being able to create money for free that everyone else has to work for, right? They've had that privilege for decades and decades and decades and decades. And this is why Bitcoin is so important. I have a saying that I say all the time: Bitcoin or slavery. I talked to Beautyon, who is the co-founder of Azteco. It's this non-KYC. It's a way to buy Bitcoin non-KYC. And I told Beautyon, said, hey, do you agree with that statement? He said, no, Nico, it's not Bitcoin or slavery. It's Bitcoin or death.
Wow, you gave me your we got the whole show just covered in one rant. Let's break that down a little bit. So there's a lot I want to dig into there. Let's just go back to the beginning. You tweet every day, Bitcoin or slavery. Beautyon said it's not slavery, it's death. I think that some things are worse than death. Slavery might be worse than death. There's certainly things that are worse. The saying we say in America is rather live on my feet than die on my knees, so to speak. So in regards to that. You haven't changed your tweet. You still tweet that out, right? Bitcoin or slavery. Why do you say that specifically, though?
Because it's clear that governments are moving full speed ahead at releasing these central bank digital currencies, right? Even in the U.S., right? Coincidentally, when they denied Caitlin Long's a federal banking charter to make her bank, Custodia Bank, competitive with other banks, shortly after, the White House released the Presidential Economic Report. It's a yearly report. In that report, they dedicated 20 entire pages as to why central banking is necessary, CBDCs are necessary, and why you need a state to have a money. Also in Europe, you have a big push for CBDCs as well. And of course, China, which I think a lot of the Western countries are really taking cues from. And I think what they're trying to implement in the West is a China light model. We saw it in the response to the Canadian truckers protests, how, look, they just cut off people's money for a political protest. So I think governments all around the world, including in Western countries, are moving full speed ahead to implement a central bank digital currency system. If they are successful in doing that, that is basically controlling society, because they'll shut off their money, they'll penalize you if you have certain beliefs, certain thoughts. And then the other alternative is Bitcoin. So I think it's a little bit obfuscated right now. I think people are asleep to how dire things can get and will get if they don't wake up. But that's why I mean Bitcoin or slavery. Bitcoin or slavery, and when I mean slavery, I mean central bank digital currencies. And we all know what already happens when a country migrates to a Bitcoin standard. Look at what's happening in El Salvador. It's not a coincidence that a country that fixed the base layer of society, they made it a sound base layer, the person who was elected into office is actually doing the things that he said he was going to do if he was elected. And it's not a coincidence that he has the highest approval rating of any president in the Americas, right? And it has them terrified. Look at the legacy corporate media. Look at how they reacted to Nayib Bukele. Look at how they're reacting to Javier Milei, right? When he's saying he wants to end the central bank, right? You have the legacy corporate media attacking him like crazy, and that just tells me that those two individuals are over the target. So that's what I mean when I say Bitcoin or slavery.
Yeah, I know you mentioned the trucker protest in Canada, and I think the whole world sort of got kind of brought up, saw this kind of front and center, if you will. And I remember that's really when I kind of started thinking about, without the ability to transact, or I should say the freedom to transact, there is no freedom. And so we think about in America, we have freedoms that were given to us or secured by the Constitution, such as freedom of speech or freedom of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, for example. But if I don't have the freedom to transact, to put gas in my truck to go to the assembly, or I don't have the ability to transact to buy food when I'm there, or hotel room, et cetera, then you have no freedom. And so, and to your point, if you have CBDCs which are totally controlled, then you have no freedom. You only have the freedom they give you. Your freedom of choice is choose A or B. Right? Choose the choices they give you, and so there really is no freedom there. And I think that's just super glaring. And then kind of going back to the UN's goals as well, you have throw in the digital ID. So for example, what they want is that you can't get a SIM card without an ID. You can't go on the internet without an ID. And then you put those two together, and it certainly is a world of slavery. You mentioned what's going on in El Salvador, which is pretty interesting. I think it's a great experiment. We have lots of these experiments. For some reason, people just can't wake up to them. For example, you have I think, arguably the two best experiments ever in human history, and we can just see them. They're not old. In Germany, you have one group of people living in one area that have the same genes, the same lineage, the same ideology, and you literally put a wall down the middle in Berlin. You had East and West Berlin. And one side adopted socialism or communism, and one side stayed free. And the communist side just fell apart. They couldn't do anything. We have North and South Korea. They literally put a wall. The same people, the same continent, the same area, and one side is light at night, and one is dark. And we have these going for us. And then to your point, down in El Salvador, you have someone that goes back to to your point, like a sound money that gives you like a good foundation, more freedom principles, as well as not just freedom principles, but also a rule of law. And I think that's a strong piece there. A lot of people think that he's a dictator because he was pretty harsh on some of the crime, but look at the benefits to society from that. Most smart people, you would think, would look at these examples and go, shoot, it works pretty good over there. Like, maybe we should do more of that. But unfortunately, governments, and to your point, the point that you made of Lawrence Lepard, when the governments can continue to print money, then they don't have a feedback loop, and they can continue just to pour into stupid ideas, and they don't really learn the consequence. You have Javier Milei down in Argentina. You mentioned that. I think you're Argentinian. Are you Argentinian?
I'm originally
Venezuelan.
from Venezuela.
Okay,
Yeah.
Venezuelan. I got that. Sorry. But one thing that I think is pretty interesting is that I've always thought, with democracy, mob rule, that once the majority wants to start voting themselves more money, more benefits, like no politician could ever win on a campaign to take that away. So I've always thought like there's just no way out of it once you sort of reach that level. But Argentina is showing us that maybe you actually could. Maybe people would actually vote for that. I mean, what's your thought on that?
Yeah. So essentially, it's interesting because the narratives that you hear from the legacy corporate media is Javier Milei is a danger to democracy. Nayib Bukele is a danger to democracy, even though, I agree with you, Mark, right, that the whole democratic thing, but it's interesting what happens when the democracy goes against them. And that makes you question what is their actual definition of democracy. And if you look at either Marxist history or communist history or socialist history, their definition of democracy is not the same as ours. Like if you look at Korea's actual name, North Korea's actual name, it actually has the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So they have a whole different definition. And you were mentioning the Berlin Wall, and you were mentioning North Korea and South Korea. This is a subject that I hold near and dear to my heart. I saw my home country completely destroyed by socialism in 20 years. I also live in Miami, so I see Cubans literally risking their lives getting on the raft just to reach Miami for freedom, right? And the amazing thing about Bitcoin, right, is that it's an end to that. And I think that's why they react the way they do. If you take away their wealth redistribution mechanism of printing money, it's extracting wealth from the lower and middle classes, I think it calls that whole ideology, that political system into question. And I think that's why they're reacting the way they are. In Argentina, we have a very interesting case study going back to Javier Milei, because you have a country who's currently enduring 105% inflation, 110% inflation. People are sick and tired of the traditional political parties, and it kind of created a very similar situation to El Salvador. El Salvador dealt with 20, 30 years of war. People were sick and tired of the same political parties, and they were ready to try something new. Right, so you have very interesting case studies in El Salvador and Argentina. I think when people get pushed to an extreme, they want to try something different, and that's in stark contrast to the West, where the bread and circuses are strong. The inflation rate isn't high enough for people to start asking a very, very important but very basic question, and that question is, what is money?
Yeah. So what you're saying is that we only move when the pain is high enough. And so it's like you have a friend or family member who's alcoholic or drug addict, and you're like, you need help, you need rehab or whatever, but they don't see it, right? The pain hasn't got high enough. And so then you go, well, they have to hit rock bottom first. And so you have to, unfortunately, Not always. I mean, unfortunately, your country, your home country of Venezuela, hasn't hit rock bottom yet, and it's been pretty far. But some of these countries, like Argentina, potentially have. But I just think it's an interesting thought because, like I said, I thought maybe there's no way out of it in this democracy, if you will. Do you follow Balaji on Twitter? I don't know if you follow
Balaji. He sounds familiar. I think I do follow him, but
he's been talking a lot about these like different forms of democracy recently. He wrote like what was it? The network state. He's been talking about that network state, that piece. He's like an original founder of Coinbase, and he's like an OG Bitcoiner, but he's also sort of an altcoiner, so a lot of Bitcoiners don't really like him. But anyway, he's been talking a lot about democracy, these different forms. He said there's 4 different forms of democracy, and to the point that you said, that what the sort of Democrat version of democracy is today is it's our way, right? It's what we want, kind of a thing, which I think is pretty interesting. In regards to some of the things that are going on, one of the things, these are always messy situations, if you will. I'm curious to get your point on it, having this sort of lens of seeing how things have gone wrong. One thing we hear a lot is like Bitcoin is used by criminals. What's your take on that?
My take is that is another bait and switch used by the enemies of Bitcoin. If you actually look at the data, the vast majority of money laundering and criminal activity is done in the US dollar, right? There was a chain analysis report that was released a couple days ago. Actually, it was the Department of Justice that had a problem with this chain analysis report. But if you look into the data coming out of the chain analysis report, it's less than a percentage point of illicit activity being used in the Bitcoin network, right? Criminals prefer cash. They don't prefer open ledgers. But I think, once again, it's being used as a straw man argument. So last year, the Department of Treasury, and there's an office in the Department of Treasury called the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. They used North Korea dealing with Bitcoin using this mixer thing called Tornado Cash. They used that as a justification to sanction open source software, setting a precedent that's never been done in American history before. So the reason I'm bringing this up is I think they'll use anything and everything to try to find something that sticks, to demonize Bitcoin. And they're even using this in the rhetoric. They're even using this in the wording. For example, in the recent bill that was introduced by Elizabeth Warren, it's a bipartisan bill. She has had some Republicans sign on to it, which would effectively kill the Bitcoin mining industry in the US, according to Pierre Richard. In that bill, they use the word unhosted wallet and hosted wallet. I don't know about you, Mark, but I've never seen the word unhosted wallet mentioned in the Bitcoin white paper. Unhosted wallet basically means that if you're taking your Bitcoin into self-custody, that is unhosted. But you see how they mess with the words? Unhosted wallet and hosted wallet. The unhosted wallet is as if that's the abnormal wallet, right? And what they're trying to do is they're trying to convince the uninformed American, the uninformed person, that somehow an unhosted wallet is dangerous. Somehow holding your own money is dangerous. Somehow holding your own money is going to enable money laundering, terrorism, all the things under the sun. So yeah, I think they're trying to find any straw man argument possible in order to stop Bitcoin adoption, because if Bitcoin adoption continues to accelerate the way it is, it's a threat to the current system. It's a threat to their ability to create money for free that other human beings have to work with. If that cat gets out of the bag, if people start to realize I have the ability to use a money that doesn't steal from me. In fact, I have the ability to use a money that actually increases in purchasing power. They don't have a good response to that. So I think that's just another straw man argument. I think they're going to continue to accelerate, and I think they're going to continue to get more aggressive, because I believe that they're stuck in a corner, and I think they see that.
They need to maintain power, not just power over money, but just power generally. And of course, control the money, control the world, so to speak, right? But it's not just about greed. I think there's also power there. And I think The reason why I want to kind of expand it a little bit is you go back to just censorship overall. I think one of the biggest attributes of Bitcoin is its censorship resistant ability. And we've already talked about this in the beginning, which is without the freedom to transact, there's no freedom. So maybe even the freedom to transact is even more important than the freedom of speech, if you will, right? I mean, it's a form of communication, right? And so, I think about ways that they're trying to really crimp down on that whole thing. In Canada, they're passing 2 bills that want to prevent, us from doing what we're doing, creating content, being podcasters, things like this. Obviously, see what's going on over in Europe with Russell Brand. He's allegedly accused of some things. They're trying to take away his ability to earn money now, which is insane. And so when you think about it, it's like really like you have this regime that is no longer relevant, and they're trying to hang on to power as best as they can. And the only way they can continue to hang on to power is through censorship and control. Right. So trying to prevent this real democratic process from happening, prevent us from being able to manage our own money and send it away, send it around, things like that. You mentioned Elizabeth Warren and some of the bills that they're doing in the United States. They passed this, or they haven't passed it. They've presented this Restrict Act bill, which has, I think, 24 high-ranking members of government, including the majority of them are Republicans, I think, which is pretty scary. And that basically says any piece of technology they deem to be a threat to national security, they could just make it illegal to use, sort of like this mixer that you referenced. But I want to think about this for a minute, and this is just a deeper dive into this. So you made the point, and the data backs you up, that most of the illicit activity does happen in dollars. It does, not Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's an open ledger. You can kind of track it. It's not the best way to do it. But what about them using it for criminal activity? I saw today over Israel, Hamas. Israel seized 100 some accounts of Hamas from cryptocurrency. They were on Binance or whatever. But you do have potential, you do have potential terrorists or whatever bad illicit activity happening in Bitcoin. Should they have the control to shut that down?
I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think if you look at the First Amendment, right? There's a reason that the founding fathers set it up in a way where, because they knew that if the government had the ability to dictate speech, they would use that power in order to protect their political moat. And we have to choose whether we want a money on which no one controls, no one can censor, or do we want a money where a bureaucratic elite have that godlike power to censor and to stop something. And this reminds me of this Jeff Booth tweet. And he goes on to say, because broken money ensures the centralization of power by stealing the productivity through inflation that should flow to society in the form of lower prices. Those enriched by that theft and subsequent power must control the messaging to keep it. Right? So it goes back to your point. Yes, it has to do with power. Yes, it has to do with censorship. But I think what the root problem, the root cause of all this is the broken money. I think because there is broken money, I think they'll do everything and anything, including censor. And this was actually something that Nayib Bukele wrote in his famous article, Don't Drink the Elite's Kool-Aid, that their most important weapon is their control of truth. And they'll use that weapon in order to maintain it. Now, going back to terrorist organizations using Bitcoin, I don't have the data in front of me, but I bet my bottom dollar that those terrorist organizations are using the dollar way more than Bitcoin. Now, is it bad? Of course it's bad that, some terrorist organizations are going to use Bitcoin. We have to talk about what the pros and the cons are. Bingo. Do we want to live in a world where, like I said, a powerful political cabal get to use that power? And again, history has shown that they haven't used that power for the better every single time. A lot of the time they've used that power to protect themselves. I mean, look, the Patriot Act was passed, because of the September 11 attacks. Fast forward 10, 15, 20 years later, that same Patriot Act is being used to attack everyday Americans. So I think as a society, we really have to, really ask that very important question. There's pros and cons to both systems. I know what system I would rather use.
Yeah. And that is the most important part that you said right there. And this is the I was actually having a conversation with Q, my producer, a little before the show, talking about this, that most people just lack nuance, right? Almost nothing is like black and white. I mean, there may be a couple things, but most things have some sort of nuance there. And so you have to look at the cost benefit analysis, or the pros and cons, or whatever you want to call it, the trade-offs. Everything's trade-offs, right? And so there might be a few people that do bad things with it, but you don't want to penalize the 99% of the people for the 1 or 2% of people that might do bad things. The other thing is that we have laws against doing bad things. So like, we want to prevent terrorists from killing people. Well, we happen to have laws for killing people. We happen to have laws for that. Those terrorists probably drink water. They probably drive cars, right? Like, we can't take away everything that they use, right? We can't take away these tools. And so they used cars to get to their meeting to plan this, whatever attack they did or whatever. We should ban cars. It just doesn't make sense. And so it doesn't make sense to ban the money, especially considering the trade-offs that we have, where, to your point, these people are stealing our lives. Really, I mean, that's what it comes down to, right? I mean, just if you think about home ownership alone, it's gone from 2.5 years average time it takes to save for a home pre-1971 to now almost 6.5 years to save for a home. It's like 4 years of my life that was just taken away. So it doesn't make sense to do that. I think, to your point, thinking about the pros and cons of that is certainly the right way to think about that. It's just hard for people to think past first order thinking today, right? Seems like.
100%. And just to kind of add to your point about the home ownership, look, if you are under the age of 35, you're nothing more than a serf. Like, you won't own anything. In fact, their own propaganda has gotten to the point where they're telling you the quiet part out loud, right? You know how they call the Bitcoin conference the Freedom Conference? I call the World Economic Forum the Cantillionaire Conference. Their own propaganda is literally telling us you'll own nothing and be happy. So if you're under a certain age group, if you're a millennial, if you're a Zoomer, every time they print money, it's a wealth redistribution mechanism from the lower and middle classes, which tend to be the younger generations, back to the government, back to the very wealthy. Assets become unaffordable, right? So the American dream that my parents had when they were growing up, or my parents really didn't grow up here, but what I've heard, Americans, the so-called American dream, that, that's becoming more and more unattainable to a lot of people in my generation, until Bitcoin. Bitcoin is now my American dream. Bitcoin now allows me to save for the future without fear of confiscation or wealth debasement.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. So you're absolutely right. We can see that all the data shows us that the rich keep getting richer, the poor are getting left behind. The reason why, though, is because the rich buy assets, and asset prices are going to the moon. So as they continue to print money, asset prices go higher. So the reason why the rich keep getting richer is because they own the stocks, they own the houses, et cetera. And so as those go up, and people don't. Now, I would say, first of all, first question is, so why can't millennials buy assets? And I get it, like, house prices are too high, but you can buy cheap homes in the Midwest. You can buy an $80,000 home, no problem. You can also buy one share of stock. And so maybe there's an education gap there where, like, people are consuming too much, and so we're in this like consumption culture. But also at the same time, as Michael Saylor talks about, that now for the first time in history, people can actually own a little bit of property, like this digital property. So maybe that's opening that up. I want to have that conversation, but one of the best ways that we've been able to own property outside of the system, outside of the control, and that can help keep up with inflation for over 5,000 years has been gold. Nico and I are both big fans of Bitcoin, but gold has been around for a really long time, and it's done really well in the light of this adversity we have, this global macroeconomic picture, but as well as this sort of uncertain war culture that we have going on today, which is why you've seen gold's up by almost 16% since last October. Silver's up 30% since October. And I've been working with a company called Universal Coin and Bullion. And I like them because Dr. Mike Fulgen and his company have written the guide on protecting your wealth in gold through watching out for fraud. And they have really good prices. You can trust them, and they have good prices. And they got a very special offer for my listeners where you can get a 1 ounce American Silver Eagle coin with no dealer markup, just $27. Maximum limit of 3, and they'll even ship it to you for free if you mention my name. Give them a call Universal Coin and Bullion at 1-800-UCB-GOLD. Again, that's 1-800-UCB-GOLD, or you can go online to universalcoin.com/Mark Moss. we have this divide between the rich and the poor, and the reason why it continues to get wider is because the rich own assets. And while certainly a lot of assets, to the Cantillon effect, are getting priced out, and sure, it's getting harder for millennials to buy houses and all those things, millennials can buy assets, and they could see their wealth go up just like the boomers do as well. Obviously, real wages have gone down, so it's harder to do that. And I'm not saying that it's not a struggle, but they basically have the same opportunity to buy assets that most people do today, not counting BlackRock and Blackstone and those guys. But do you think part of it comes down to, one, I guess, education? They don't understand that. And two, maybe the culture that we have today is sort of like this instant gratification. So they'd rather go out and party with their boys at night and buy a bottle than buy assets. Do you think it's maybe more that, or is it that people are struggling so much they don't even have a spare dime to put into an asset?
So I think it's a combination of both, right? According to a CNBC article, 61% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So, right. A huge percentage of the American public, they can't afford to buy assets. That in turn gives a very bad lane to capitalism, because people blame capitalism for literally something that was caused by a central bank, by centralization, right, by central planning. So I think that contributes to it. And then
just to cut you off on that, per Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, point number 5, 10 points of communism. Point number 5 is a central bank. That's not a capitalism thing. That's a communist thing. But anyway, keep going.
Absolutely, 100%. By the way, I highly recommend that book. It's great. Mark and Svetsky wrote it. Very, very good book. So I think it's a combination of people just not being able to afford things, and then that infects the culture, right? So you have a lot of the youth that are nihilistic, right? They live for tomorrow. They don't live for the future. This whole saving idea is completely out of the question. A lot of the socialist and Marxist ideas start to seem alluring, and rightly so to them, because they feel like they got jaded. Where they're mistaken. Where they're mistaken is that it's not the economic system that's broken. It's the money that's broken, right? And that's the lift really to us Bitcoiners and content creators like yourself, Mark, you being one of the most talented that I know. It's really getting that message out there, breaking out of the Bitcoin echo chamber, so to speak, and really educating people on the matter. It's like, hey, it's a good idea to save. It's a good idea to have hope for the future. But I think if you're living under a fiat standard, I think that it's impossible to have hope for the future. I think you're nihilistic living on a fiat standard. I think if you live on Bitcoin, or if you live on a physical gold standard, right, where your wealth isn't being devalued, I think that changes your operating system in your mind, and all of a sudden you have optimism for the future. You start thinking long term. You start thinking about saving for a brighter and better future, right? So I think it's a combination of people just can't afford to buy assets, and just this cultural issue that has infected society in the U.S. coming from a communist country, coming from a socialist company to the U.S. I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, the U.S. is one of the greatest countries on planet Earth, and I'm extremely grateful to be here. I don't see that in the U.S. today. With a lot of people that were natively born here, they grow up and it's almost as if they hate the country, right? And to me, that blows my mind. Right, so I think it's a combination of two factors.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think maybe the point that I'm kind of digging out in that is that we the youth potentially education system has kind of taught us that we have to own a home, and because I can't afford to own a home, then I just can't afford anything, so I'll just go party all my money away. The stock market, whatever, it's going to fall. I mean, what am I going to do? Buy one share of Amazon? What's that going to do for me? But I could just buy $5 worth of Bitcoin. And so it's like, oh, well, I'll just put $15 in. And then it's like, it's like the starting is always the hardest part. So once you get $15 worth, then it goes to 25. It's like, well, let me see if I can get to 100. Let me see if I can get to 1,000. Let me see, and then it kind of starts that path. So maybe it's like it lowers the bar to ownership, and it kind of gives you this advantage of maybe this newer asset class that maybe has some potential versus the Amazon or Nvidia that's probably already overvalued. So it's sort of like maybe gives someone a lower barrier to entry, but really it's just about starting and kind of getting that ball rolling. In regards to that, starting and getting the ball rolling, one of the biggest things that I think we've probably always been hit, I'm sure you have been hit up as many times as I have, is when people are thinking about Bitcoin is like, won't the governments just make it illegal? And we had started out this conversation talking about how they're trying to pass bills to prevent it. We got Elizabeth Warren and her crew, Gary Gensler and his crew, et cetera, trying to really kind of prevent this. In the EU, trying to pass laws to kind of restrict it, et cetera. And so one of these questions that we hear all the time is like, won't they just make it illegal? But we're sort of at this point where like the level of entrenchment inside the government has reached a pretty high level. We now have like dozens of like high-ranking members in government that are Bitcoiners now, including to the point you were talking about current acting Speaker of the House, the third highest member in the government right now, Patrick McHenry, is a Bitcoiner.
100%. And if you look at the presidential, line of succession, right, God forbid anything happens to Biden or Vice President Kamala Harris, he will become president, right? And of course, and technically he's an interim speaker. They're looking for the next speaker, but he hosts the Bitcoin white paper on his website. He's been very, very pro Bitcoin, anti CBDC, but it's not only just happening on the House level, right? It's also happening on the presidential level as well. The second place for the Republican presidential, second and third place, Ron DeSantis, who is currently governor of Florida, he passed an anti-CBDC bill in Florida, and one of the mission statements that he said if he were to be elected president would be to protect Bitcoin. He literally said that, quote, protect Bitcoin. Second is also Vivek Ramaswamy, who's also a big fan of Bitcoin. And it's a bipartisan thing because on the Democratic side, I know he just stepped down from the Democratic side and he went independent. We have RFK Jr., who gave that famous speech at the Bitcoin 2023 conference where he said, if you elect me, I'll protect your right to run a node, take self-custody of your Bitcoin. So there's a non-zero chance that in 2024, we'll have a pro-Bitcoin, anti-CBDC president in the White House. And I'm calling it right now. By the time 2028 comes along, I think it's going to become politically unviable for any politician to run a successful campaign in the US and have a chance of getting elected if they take an anti-Bitcoin, pro-CBDC stance. So in terms of moving the Overton window, in terms of where we're heading, I think we're heading in the right direction. And they have a really, really hard time because they have a race against the clock to really roll out this CBDC and get this CBDC adopted before enough of the population is holding Bitcoin.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I would also throw out Tulsi Gabbard was also from the Democratic Party. Now she's sort of like leaving that, but it is sort of bipartisan. To your point, she spoke at the Bitcoin conference as well. So we do really see both sides of them there. And this level of entrenchment that we've seen to the government is massive. To your point, so I like that. I would say it's interesting. You kind of made the point that in 2028 it would be someone wouldn't be able to win running on like this anti-Bitcoin platform. We've seen Elizabeth Warren coming on this like anti-crypto platform, if you will. And I asked ChatGPT, I said, when in history, U.S. history, has any politician run on a platform to ban something or take something away? And it gave me this answer that it's never happened and no one would ever run on that because America is a free country and who would ever run on taking away freedoms? And I'm like, exactly. Like, how is this running on an anti-platform to take away my right to have something? Just makes no sense. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Mark Moss Show. I've been sitting down with Nico Moran, the host of Simply Bitcoin TV and director of content over at Swan Bitcoin. Check him out over there. Give him a follow. We'll link to him in the show notes down below. And that's what we got for the show today. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.